He saw a night shift nurse with efficient hands and no medical degree. He didn't see the three-layer closure technique perfected under mortar fire. He didn't see the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, hidden beneath the hospital scrubs of Margaret Walsh. St. Michael's Hospital in Atlanta hums with fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell that never quite leaves your clothes, no matter how many times you wash them. The night shift moves in its own rhythm, slower than day but heavier somehow, as if the darkness outside the windows adds weight to every decision. Margaret completes her third year on this floor, moving between rooms like water, finding the path of least resistance, her presence barely registering to the hierarchy that orbits the physician's lounge. She slides a medication chart back into the rack at 2:22 a.m., her hands moving with a kind of efficiency that comes from repetition so complete it becomes invisible. 3 years of medication rounds, vitals checks, catheter placements, dressing changes, the work that holds a hospital together but never gets the credit. The other nurses notice. They trust her with their patients during breaks. They ask her opinion when something feels wrong. But the doctors barely register her name. She is furniture. Capable furniture, but furniture nonetheless. Dr. Mercer has been watching her for 6 months. Not in the way a mentor watches a promising resident. In the way a king watches a subject who forgets their place. His 23 years of seniority have calcified into something harder than respect, a need to be the smartest person in every room, the voice that matters, the mind that cannot be questioned. Margaret's quiet competence threatens this architecture. When nurses defer to her judgment about a patient's status before waiting for his orders, he feels it like a small blade. When an attending physician asks her opinion on a wound closure instead of consulting him first, he remembers it for weeks. She doesn't seek authority. That is what infuriates him most. She simply has it. People believe her because she speaks only when certain, because she moves with the precision of someone who has already solved the problem while others are still formulating the question. There is no arrogance in her, which makes her more dangerous. Arrogance can be challenged. Competence is harder to argue with. Margaret moves through the medication room, checking dosages against the electronic chart. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a cold blue glow that makes the world look slightly unreal. She reaches for a 1 milligram vial of epinephrine, checks the label twice, muscle memory from another life, another profession, another person entirely. Her fingers brush against her jacket hanging on the back of the locker. She can feel it through the fabric. The patch. 6 inches by 4 inches of faded olive drab cloth, worn at the edges, stitched into the lining with thread that has held for nearly a decade. She doesn't touch it intentionally. She never does. But her body knows it is there. The patch remembers things her mouth cannot speak. It remembers Baghdad General, 2019. A trauma bay with the ceiling 3 feet too low and the smell of diesel fuel mixed with blood and cordite. It remembers a Marine Corps medic with a blast wound to the upper right quadrant, bleeding faster than the 4 could replace it. It remembers her hands moving through the 3-layer closure technique, superficial layer with 3 to 0 absorbable suture, dermal layer with interrupted stitches tied to hold tension, skin closure with nylon to minimize scarring. The technique itself was nothing revolutionary. But the context was. Mortar fire outside. The tent shaking. Your hand steady because the alternative is someone dies. The patch remembers all of this. Margaret closes the medication cart and rolls it back to the nurse's station. The night is quiet. There are 7 patients on the floor. All stable. All routine. She checks monitors with the kind of attention that makes the difference between good nursing and excellent nursing, the kind that catches the small changes that become big problems if missed. One of the patients, Mrs. Chen in room for 12, has a slight elevation in heart rate. Nothing critical. Nothing that requires immediate intervention. But Margaret notes it, watches it. She will mention it today's shift. She will include it in the handoff. The decision to be thorough is the only decision she makes about anything. Dr. Mercer arrives at 3:15 a.m. for rounds, moving through the hospital with the kind of purposefulness that announces his importance. He is tall, and he has learned to use this, the way he stands in doorways, the way his presence fills rooms, the way his voice carries without needing to raise volume. He is handsome in a way that has worked for him professionally, the kind of face that appears in fundraising photos and hospital board meetings. His watch costs more than Margaret's car. She has never noticed this, which is precisely why he resents her. He stops at the nursing station and Margaret approaches automatically, chart already prepared. Her voice is quiet when she speaks. Admiral Kincaid is incoming. Trauma transport arriving in approximately 12 minutes. Baghdad IED complications with shrapnel fragments in upper thorax. Military transport direct from Landstuhl Regional Medical Center. Dr. Mercer takes the information without acknowledging her directly. He is already thinking about this case, about the complexity it will bring, about the opportunity it represents. A Navy Admiral. Important. High profile. The kind of patient that matters. And then his eyes settle on Margaret, on her calm face, on the way she stands waiting for his orders like a subordinate should. You will take primary care nursing on this case, he says. Not asks. States. The assignment is a calculation. She is good. The Admiral will require excellent care. But Mercer is already thinking 3 moves ahead. She will be assigned to something complex. If something goes wrong, he can control the narrative. If it goes right, he will ensure the credit flows elsewhere. You understand the severity of the case, I'm sure. Yes, Doctor, Margaret says. Her hands are steady. Her voice carries no inflection of concern or pride or anything else that might be interpreted as emotion. She is a mirror. She simply reflects what is needed. Mercer cannot understand people like this. He has built his career on projection and assertion, on taking up space until others retreat. Margaret does not retreat because she does not advance. She simply stands where she is and somehow ends up exactly where she needs to be. The Admiral arrives 15 minutes later, wheeled through the emergency entrance on a stretcher that looks too small for his frame. He is still unconscious, still intubated, still held together by the grace of medical intervention and military-grade determination. Margaret is already in the trauma bay when they roll him in. She has prepared the room. Cardiac monitor positioned. For fluids hanging. Trauma shears laid out on the steel table in a precise arrangement. Pain is data. Every small detail either helps or hinders. She does not waste movements on either. She wears her composure like armor, but it is a different kind of armor than what Mercer wears. His is meant to be seen. Hers is meant to be invisible. She starts the admission process, vitals, labs, imaging orders. The team that brought him from Landstuhl hands off the case with the kind of professional respect that exists between competent people. They brief her directly, not Mercer, because they know from the way she listens that she will retain the information. Mercer stands at the edge of the room, observing. Already beginning to form his narrative. Margaret's fingers brush the inside of her jacket lining as she passes her locker at 4:02 a.m., the Admiral stable in ICU, the first shift now beginning to arrive. She does not allow herself to think about Baghdad. She does not allow herself to think about the medics who learned that 3-layer closure technique from her, or the lives that technique saved across 7 years and 4 months of surgical practice in a tent that was never meant to be permanent. All of that exists in a different time. A different person. A different rank that no hospital credential verifies. But the patch knows. And on the night shift at St. Michael's Hospital in Atlanta, with a Navy Admiral assigned to her care and Dr. Mercer watching from the shadows with something like hunger in his eyes, Margaret understands that the line between her 2 lives is about to become very, very thin. The morning round started like any other Tuesday at St. Michael's, fluorescent lights humming their relentless hymn, the rhythm of monitors creating a baseline hum beneath everything else. Dr. Mercer moved through the ICU with his entourage trailing like satellites caught in orbit, 2 residents and a nervous medical student scribbling notes on clipboards. Margaret was changing the Admiral's dressing when Mercer stopped mid-stride, his voice cutting through the room like a scalpel finding tissue. "Nurse Walsh," he said, not a question but a summons. Perhaps you could explain to everyone why you think your associate degree qualifies you to question my treatment plan. The family turned. The Admiral's sister froze mid-sip of her coffee. A nephew who'd been reading the morning news glanced up, confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere. Margaret kept her hand steady on the sterile field. She didn't look up. The bandage she was applying required precision, 3 layers, each one placed with the kind of methodical care that came from having done this under mortar fire in tents where the power went out twice a week. She finished the last tape strip before responding. "I questioned the dosage, doctor, not your credentials." Her voice dropped low, measured, each word placed like stones crossing a river. She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then returned to her work. No tremor. No apology. Just a nurse stating fact in a hospital room where 7 people now held their collective breath. Mercer's jaw tightened. This wasn't the retreat he'd orchestrated. His face flushed, not red but a deeper shade, like someone had dimmed the lights inside him and replaced them with something hotter. He turned and continued rounds, but Margaret had already registered the shift in his body language. The calculated cruelty had turned into something else, calculation with an edge now sharp enough to draw blood. That afternoon, Mercer was in the chief of surgery's office on the 2nd floor, closing the door with the kind of deliberate softness that suggested what came next was serious. He placed 3 pages on the desk, medication logs with Margaret's initials, each one circled in red pen. His voice was smooth, almost sympathetic. "I hate bringing this forward," he said, which was the kind of opening that made lies sound like mercy. "But I've noticed discrepancies. Margaret's documentation doesn't match the actual dosages administered. Either she's falsifying records or she's administering without proper authorization." The chief of surgery, Dr. Harrison, a woman in her 60s with the exhausted competence of someone who'd been cleaning up other people's messes for 30 years, leaned back in her chair. Her eyes moved across the pages. She didn't look convinced, but she looked concerned, which was exactly what Mercer needed. "I've also spoken with Dr. Chen and Dr. Patel," Mercer continued. They both expressed concern about Margaret attempting to override treatment protocols during rounds. "She's bright, but she's overstepping her scope." None of this was true. All of it was plausible. That was the difference between casual bullying and calculated demolition. Mercer wasn't screaming insults in hallways. He was filing documentation, having private conversations, building a narrative that would survive scrutiny because it looked like institutional process instead of personal vendetta. Within 2 hours, 2 attending physicians had been called. Mercer's words had reached them independently, filtered through the kind of professional concern that made accusations sound like worried conversations between colleagues. By evening, a formal write-up appeared on the unit board in the break room, printed on official hospital letterhead, dated and stamped with Dr. Mercer's signature, insubordination and procedural violations. Failure to follow chain of command. Unauthorized scope creep. Documentation irregularities. Margaret read it while standing at the coffee station at 6:36 p.m., the paper still slightly warm from the printer. Her name was right there in 12-point font, spelled correctly, which somehow made it worse than if they'd gotten it wrong. There was a formal investigation process outlined at the bottom. A meeting was scheduled for Friday. She was instructed not to deviate from assigned tasks pending review. She folded the page back to the board and finished her coffee. The break room at shift change was crowded, nurses arriving for night shift, nurses leaving day shift, all of them moving through the narrow space like water finding channels around rocks. Margaret sat at the small table in the corner with her coffee, watching the clock shift from 7:02 to 7:08 to 7:15. 6 nurses she'd worked alongside for 3 years, nurses she'd covered for during family emergencies, nurses whose children she'd asked about, nurses whose lives she'd never pried into, gathered their things in a deliberate choreography. They didn't look at her. They didn't speak to each other, which was the thing that made it choreography instead of accident. Someone had orchestrated this silence, and they'd all agreed to the dance. The last one to leave was Jennifer, who Margaret had mentored through her first critical care rotation. Jennifer paused at the doorway, her hand on the frame, her mouth opening like she might speak. Then she glanced at the break room glass, where Dr. Mercer stood in the hallway, and she left without a word. Margaret sat alone with her coffee growing cold. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her head like insects trapped in plastic. She let one tear slide down her cheek, not from sadness but from the sudden weight of it, the realization that isolation wasn't a punishment in hospitals, it was a death sentence. A nurse without colleagues was a nurse without information, without backup, without anyone who'd remember to check on her if something went wrong. She wiped her face with a paper towel and maintained her gaze through the glass partition. Dr. Mercer was still there, watching her like someone might watch a laboratory experiment showing the expected results. She stood, met his eyes, and spoke quietly enough that only the glass between them heard it. "You're making a mistake, Doctor." He smiled. Not a confident smile but the smile of someone who'd already won, which was different. She could read it like tactical assessment. He believed her isolation was complete, her career trajectory locked into decline, her credibility dismantled enough that whatever came next would be simply cleanup. He had no idea that she'd been embedded with 3 separate naval intelligence protocols, or that the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining contained microfilm of the last 2 years of intelligence on the Admiral's assassination attempts, or that the way she was about to move through the next 72 hours would change the entire equation. But none of that showed. She simply turned back to her cold coffee and finished it. The next morning, Margaret was doing a dressing change on the Admiral's abdominal wound, a meticulous 3-layer closure technique using interrupted sutures with a specific spacing that required the kind of precision most nurses never developed. A Marine Corps medic had been assigned to assist, a young gunnery sergeant named Price who moved with the compact efficiency of someone who'd done this work in field conditions where efficiency meant survival. Margaret's hands moved through the procedure with muscle memory that transcended conscious thought. Suture, not cat. Suture, not cat. The wound was healing properly, no sign of infection, no fluid accumulation, no dehiscence along the line. The Admiral was lucky. Most people who took shrapnel from an IED didn't get a second dressing change performed by someone who understood the difference between a closure that looked good and a closure that would hold. Halfway through the 3rd layer, Gunnery Sergeant Price froze. His hand, which had been assisting with the suture tension, simply stopped. His eyes were fixed on the technique Margaret was using, the specific angle of the needle, the depth of penetration, the spacing between stitches. There was something about that particular method that had locked something in his memory. "Baghdad General," he whispered, barely audible. 2019, you were the one who taught us that. Margaret's hands didn't pause. She completed the suture, tied the knot, cut the line. Only then did she look up at him. Her eyes were steady, and in them was the specific kind of command that comes from someone who spent years ensuring that classified information stayed classified. Not anger. Not fear. Just authority, clear and unmistakable as a salute. Price stepped back, confusion rippling across his face like wind across water. He'd just recognized something he shouldn't have been able to recognize, but the woman performing the dressing change had already made it clear in 2 seconds of eye contact that there were protocols in place. Instructions. Things that preceded his current assignment by years, by theaters of operation, by chains of command he didn't have clearance to understand. He finished the assisting work in silence and left the room without asking questions. But that wasn't the worst part. At 11:43 p.m. that night, Admiral Kincaid's fever spiked to 104.2 degrees. His white blood cell count climbed into the stratosphere. The infection, some kind of gram-negative rod they hadn't been able to fully identify, was spreading faster than the antibiotics could contain it. His oxygen saturation began a slow, inexorable decline. 76%. 72. 68. Margaret watched the numbers fall like someone watching a countdown she couldn't stop. She called the rapid response team. She notified ICU attending staff. She hung additional units of fluid, pushed antibiotics on an accelerated schedule, positioned the Admiral for optimal respiratory effort. All of it standard protocol. All of it futile against an infection that had already established itself in places antibiotics couldn't reach. By 2:17 a.m., The ICU was filling with doctors. The fever spiked at 2:17 in the morning. 104.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Margaret watched the monitor from the bedside, her hand steady on Admiral Kincaid's wrist, feeling the pulse race beneath her fingers like a bird thrown against glass. His skin burned with the kind of heat that meant the infection had moved beyond the wound site. Sepsis didn't announce itself. It crept. It established supply lines through the bloodstream while antibiotics pounded at locked doors they couldn't breach. The ICU hummed its mechanical lullaby around them. Ventilators. Heart monitors. For pumps ticking in their synchronized rhythm like 1,000 clocks counting down. The Admiral's breathing had grown shallow. His lips had taken on a greyish tint that no amount of supplemental oxygen could correct. The shrapnel from Baghdad had done more damage than the initial surgery revealed. There were fragments lodged in places the X-rays couldn't clearly visualize. Places where inflammation could gather like an army preparing for siege. Margaret adjusted his cooling blanket and noted the vitals on his chart. 98% oxygen saturation. Blood pressure 115/72. Heart rate 138. Each number told a story, and the story was deterioration. She'd seen it before. In tents under mortar fire. In field hospitals where the temperature rose to 115 degrees and soldiers lay on cots soaked in sweat and morphine and the copper stench of their own blood. Pain was information. Fever was a warning. She stepped away from his bedside and moved toward her locker in the break room. The corridor was empty at this hour. Just the sound of her shoes on the tile. Click! 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 The fluorescent lights flickered in their familiar pattern, and she pushed through the break room door into blessed silence. Her locker stood in the corner, metal grey and unremarkable. Inside hung her spare scrubs, her stethoscope, her personal effects. And sewn into the lining of her faded unit jacket, the one she never wore to the hospital, the one that hung in the back like a ghost from another life, was the patch. Margaret removed the jacket slowly. The fabric was thin now, worn soft by years of storage. She ran her fingers along the interior seam where the patch had been stitched in by hands that belonged to a surgical unit that no longer officially existed. The stitching was precise. Military issue. The patch itself bore no insignia now. It had been bleached clean, sterilized of identification, but it still carried weight. Historical weight. The weight of decisions made under fire. She pressed her fingers against the seam and felt it. The object beneath the fabric. Cold. Smooth. Weighted like intention. A combat knife. 7 inches of stainless steel that had performed more than surgical work in Baghdad in 2019. She'd carried it then. She'd trained soldiers to carry it as a last resort, as a backup tool, as proof that medicine and warfare could exist in the same moment if necessity demanded it. She'd hidden it here years ago when she'd taken the civilian nursing position, when she'd buried Captain Margaret Walsh deep enough that even she sometimes forgot what she carried. Her hands moved on their own. No trembling. No hesitation. She located the small tear in the lining that she'd sewn deliberately, just large enough to allow retrieval if the moment ever came. And it had come. The Admiral was crashing from the inside out, and no doctor walking these halls at St. Michael's knew how to stop an infection that had already won the race to the pericardium. Margaret retrieved the knife and held it in her palm. It gleamed under the break room lights. She'd kept the blade sharp. Reflexively. The way soldiers keep weapons ready even during peace. She wrapped it carefully in a sterile towel and returned to the ICU. The Admiral's monitor was screaming at her before she reached his door. The rhythm had gone chaotic. Ventricular fibrillation. The electrical storm that meant the heart was misfiring, delivering no blood flow, no oxygen, just a useless flutter that looked violent on the monitor but delivered nothing to the body. Margaret moved with the precision of someone who'd operated in tents under mortar fire. The crash cart was already rolling toward the Admiral's bay. A cardiac nurse was starting compressions. Margaret pulled the crash cart slightly aside and set the toweled knife on the sterile field. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath and blood on standby," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. It sounded like it belonged to someone else. Someone with authority. The resident looked at her. "What are you?" "Now." Not a request. A command. The kind of command that soldiers obeyed without asking questions. She tore open the Admiral's gown. His chest was pale, mapped with surgical scars from the initial wound closure. She palpated the space between his ribs, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, and positioned her hands. The knife felt natural in her palm. Like it had never left. She opened his chest with one long, precise cut. The sound was distinct. Not like television. Quieter. More intimate. The hiss of air escaping from the thoracic cavity. Blood welled up immediately. Dark. Thick. The pericardium was distended, filled with fluid that was compressing the heart, preventing it from beating. Tamponade. The kind of complication that happened when shrapnel left fragments that migrated over time. The monitors showed the chaos she expected. She worked with both hands now, fingers navigating between ribs, palpating the pericardial sac, locating the fluid pocket. Her hands moved like apex predators. Terrifying. Fluid. Precise. Suction, she said. The nurse handed her the instrument without question. Margaret cleared the pericardial effusion with methodical calm. Yellow fluid mixed with the arterial blood. She worked with silent intensity, her breathing steady while the monitors screamed their electronic warnings. The Admiral's heart was still fibrillating. Still useless. But with the pressure relieved, it might have a chance. "Push 1 milligram epi," Margaret said. The epinephrine went in. She continued clearing the fluid, removing the clot that had formed, palpating for any fragments that might have migrated into the pericardial space. There. A shard of metal. Half an inch long. She removed it with tweezers and set it on the sterile field. The heart monitor showed a pause. Then. A beat. Weak. Irregular. But a beat. Again, she said. 1 more epi. The second dose. The chest compressions continuing. Margaret worked the remaining fluid away, using gauze to mop the blood, to clear the surgical field, to give the heart room to breathe. And then the monitor showed something beautiful. Sinus rhythm. Chaotic at first. Then steadying. The electrical activity stabilizing. The heart finding its way back to order. Margaret closed the pericardium with sutures that moved her hands back 3 years to a surgical tent in Helmand Province where she'd trained Marines to use needle and thread like weapons. 3-layer closure. The same technique that would seal the Admiral's body and give him a chance to heal. She worked without stopping, without acknowledging the doorway where Dr. Mercer now stood with 2 security guards beside him. The moment stretched. Margaret finished the last suture and stepped back. Her scrubs were soaked with blood. The combat knife lay on the sterile field. The Admiral's chest rose and fell in the ventilator's rhythm. His monitors showed stabilization. His color was returning. A pale pink instead of the gray of impending death. "Step away from the patient," Dr. Mercer said. His voice was quiet. Satisfied. "Security will take your badge." Margaret removed her blood-soaked glove slowly. Deliberately. She set down the surgical instruments. She looked at the Admiral's face, unconscious, breathing, alive, and felt no regret. Only a strange clarity. The kind that comes from choosing between rules and lives. The security guards approached. Margaret surrendered her badge without a word. She watched Mercer's expression shift from anger to understanding to something darker. He'd called them the moment he'd seen her hands inside the Admiral's chest. He'd summoned the authorities to his victory. He was already pulling his phone from his pocket, already beginning to speak the words that would end her career as a civilian nurse forever. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the young Marine corpsman standing in the ICU doorway, still in his dress uniform, still holding the surgical kit from the dressing change. He was staring at Margaret's hands, the hands that had just saved the Admiral's life using a technique he'd learned in a tent under mortar fire. His face had gone pale. Not with shock. With recognition. His lips formed the words before sound came out, "Captain." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical breath. The crash cart was 3 feet away. Margaret registered its position the way she'd registered 100 things in the last 6 seconds: distance, angle, obstacle clearance, time to execution. She didn't run. Running would draw attention. She walked, her legs moving with the controlled precision of someone who'd performed surgery in a tent while mortars impacted 200 meters away, and pulled the cart aside with her hip, just enough space to access the supply locker bolted beneath. Her hands moved on their own. Muscle memory took over, the kind that lives in tendons and bone, not thought. The locker opened. Inside, beneath a stack of sterile gauze packets, sat the faded unit patch. A 2-inch square of olive drab fabric, its edges worn soft from 3 years of her carrying it every shift, sewn into the lining of her jacket like a prayer. She peeled back the stitching with her fingernail, felt the weight shift as the blade slid free. Combat knife. The handle was wrapped in black electrical tape, worn glossy from use. The blade was 7 inches, surgical steel, sharp enough to split a human hair lengthwise. She'd last used this in Kandahar. Outside of that, only in training. Only in controlled environments. This wasn't controlled. This was the ICU at St. Michael's Hospital in Atlanta, and the man on the bed in front of her was bleeding out into his chest cavity at roughly 90 milliliters per minute. "I'm going on break," she said to the code cart, to the monitors, to no one. The smallest smile crept across her face, not manic, not hysterical. Just the kind of calm that comes when you've already died once and found out you don't actually need to be afraid of it happening again. The Admiral's breathing was labored, each inhale a wet rasp that sounded like fluid in chambers that should be empty. O2 sat at 72. The 7 doctors had called it. All of them. Mercer, the 2 cardiologists, 3 surgical attendings, and the chief of medicine had stood around the bed like mourners at a funeral, had looked at the shrapnel lodged against his right lung, at the massive hemothorax that had been building for hours, and had said the word that ended everything: futile. What they didn't understand was that futile was just another word for "I'm not trained enough to handle this," and Margaret had been trained for exactly this, in a place where the equipment was held together with duct tape and the anesthesia was whatever you could scream into, if you were lucky enough to scream at all. She prepped the site with an alcohol swab, her movements efficient as water. 2 intercostal spaces above the nipple line. 4th intercostal space, anterior axillary line. She'd done this 23 times in her life. Never with a combat knife in a hospital. Never with a chance of not going to prison afterward. The blade went in smooth and sure, the incision a 2-inch arc through skin and fascia. Blood spilled in the first second, dark venous blood mixed with brighter arterial spray. The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming their 60-cycle song. Margaret's hands were already moving to the next step, spreading the ribs with her fingers because there was no rib spreader, no surgical team, no sterile field except the one she was building in her mind with each movement. The pleural cavity opened like a mouth. Blood and fluid spilled out into the surgical field. She reached in with her left hand, fingers splayed, and found the source, the laceration in the right ventricle, a tear the size of her pinky finger weeping cardiac output onto the floor of his chest. She'd saved 43 lives in Baghdad this way. 43 people who shouldn't have lived, who the system had written off as expectant, who now had children and spouses and futures because she'd been willing to cross lines that doctors in climate-controlled hospitals spent their whole careers drawing. Her right hand went to work. Direct pressure on the laceration. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop. She needed suture material and a hand small enough to tie it off in a space the width of her palm. She grabbed 3.0 proline from the crash cart with her teeth, spitting it out onto the sterile field, and began closing the tear with stitches the size of a sesame seed, her fingers steady as a surgical laser, working blind by feel and 23 years of practice. The monitors began to change. O2 climbing. 75. 80. 82. His heart rate stabilized at 96. The pale grey color in his face began to shift toward something that looked like life again. She wrapped the temporary closure with a clear adhesive dressing, her movements economical and certain, and stepped back. The man on the table was breathing better. Not good, but better. Better was the difference between a funeral and a second chance. That's when the doors burst open. Dr. Mercer walked through first, his white coat pristine, his expression arranged in professional concern. Behind him came two uniformed hospital security officers, their badges catching the fluorescent light. Behind them, someone was already on a radio. "Step away from the patient," Mercer said. His voice was calm. The calm of someone who'd just watched his strategy execute perfectly. Margaret didn't move. She was still wearing blood. It was drying on her gloves, speckling her scrubs, painting a narrative across her chest that told the entire story without a single word. "Margaret." His voice shifted then, dropped into something that sounded almost gentle. "Step away." She removed her gloves. Dropped them on the crash cart. She didn't make eye contact. The competent nurse who knew her place would have been frightened now. The competent nurse would have apologized, would have explained that the patient was crashing and there was no time and she was trying to help. Margaret was something else entirely, and for just a moment, as she looked up, Mercer saw it. Saw the flat expression of someone who'd operated in a war zone, who'd made decisions that killed people and saved people and lived with both equally. Saw the complete absence of doubt. His jaw tightened. "You performed surgery without a medical license," he said, and now his voice had an edge to it, the edge of a man who'd anticipated her composure and hated it because he couldn't use it against her. "Unauthorized procedure on a patient. You endangered his life. You violated every protocol in this hospital." "He was dead," Margaret said. 11 words. Fragments. 7 doctors walked away. His heart rate was 40. His O2 was 68. He wasn't breathing anymore. She paused. "Now he is." One of the security officers stepped forward. Margaret recognized him. Rodriguez, worked nights, had a daughter in middle school, had nodded at Margaret twice in the break room. His face was apologetic but firm. "I need your badge," he said. She pulled the lanyard from around her neck. The badge had been with her every shift for 3 years. Blue laminate. Her photo from when she'd first started here, when the position had felt temporary, a just a nurse cover story that would last 9 months, maybe a year. 3 years of watching the Admiral recover, of keeping his details classified, of building relationships with the actual nursing staff so completely that no one looked twice at her presence, her competence, her access. The badge felt light in her hand. Rodriguez took it. Turned it over, confirmed the name, and clipped it to his own jacket. The motion was so small, so routine, that it should have felt insignificant. It felt instead like being erased. "You're suspended pending investigation," Mercer said. His voice had returned to that professional calm, but there was something underneath it now, something that sounded like victory. This was a criminal matter. "We've called the state nursing board. You're being reported for practicing medicine without a license, performing unauthorized surgery, endangering a patient's life, and gross negligence." He paused. "Let that settle. You're also being escorted from the building immediately. Security will accompany you to collect your personal items from your locker. You're not to return to St. Michael's under any circumstances pending the outcome of the investigation." The room went very still. Margaret nodded once. The acknowledgement of someone who'd just received their orders and understood them completely. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She didn't cry or tremble or beg or do any of the things a desperate person would do when their career was ending in real time. Instead, she looked at the Admiral's monitor one more time. Heart rate 94. O2 sat at 89. The lines of his face were beginning to relax now that he wasn't drowning in his own blood. Get him to the OR, she said to no one in particular. He'll need a real closure. The dressing is temporary. Maybe 4 hours before the bleeding starts again. She paused. Tell the surgical team the wound was in the RV-free wall, about 1 centimeter. Clean it out but don't go deep. The heart's already taking enough trauma. You're not authorized to give orders here, Mercer said. I know, Margaret said. She walked toward the doors, Rodriguez opening them as she approached. The Admiral's chart was still on the desk. The monitors were still beeping their steady rhythm. She didn't look back. The corridor felt longer than it had when she'd arrived 12 hours ago for the night shift. Staff members were coming out of rooms, gathering in doorways, watching the suspended nurse walk out with security on either side. Margaret kept her head level, her shoulders back, her breathing even. Not angry. Not frightened. Just moving forward the way she'd learned to move forward in places where emotion was a luxury that got people killed. The locker room was quiet. She retrieved her jacket, the one with the faded unit patch still loose in the lining, the stitches not replaced yet. She didn't touch it. Just folded the jacket over her arm and walked back out. The Atlanta rain was coming down hard when she pushed through the emergency exit, the kind of rain that came in summer, hot and heavy and relentless. It hammered on the pavement like applause for the worst performance of her life. She drove home in her 10-year-old Honda with the window down, rain soaking through her scrubs, and sat at her kitchen table for exactly 47 minutes before Emma came home from her grandmother's house. Her daughter stopped in the kitchen doorway, backpack sliding off her shoulder. 8 years old. Brown eyes. The exact shape of Margaret's jaw. Mommy? Why are you home? Margaret was still in the blood-soaked scrubs. She hadn't changed. Hadn't showered. Hadn't done anything except sit in the dark kitchen and watch the rain streak the windows, thinking about a man she couldn't save anymore, about a cover identity that had just been destroyed, about a 6-month mission that was now officially compromised because she'd chosen to save a life instead of staying anonymous. Emma climbed into her lap the way she did every afternoon when Margaret was home early, before the night shift started. Why are you crying? Emma whispered. Margaret couldn't explain it. Couldn't explain that her badge didn't work anymore, that the hospital had called her dangerous, that the man she'd just saved might never know who really saved him, that her handler was probably already writing the report about mission compromise, that everything she'd done, the sacrifice, the separation, the careful construction of a false identity, had just evaporated in 2 minutes of actual surgery. She held her daughter and said nothing, and somewhere in the silence, her phone began to ring. An unknown number. A number that appeared on the encrypted phone they'd given her when this operation started, the one that only rang in emergencies or when things had catastrophically failed. She didn't answer it. Not yet. Instead she sat in the dark kitchen with her daughter asleep against her chest, rain hammering the windows, the blood on her scrubs beginning to dry to the color of rust, and tried to remember the difference between saving a life and ending your own. The phone kept ringing. The phone kept ringing. Margaret stared at it from the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, rain hammering the windows like mortar fire, her scrubs still carrying the Admiral's blood dried to the color of rust. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her daughter slept against her chest, small and trusting, unaware that Mommy's world had just ended. The hospital had called her a dangerous person. The state nursing board would be next. She'd known this was possible when she took the assignment, but knowing and living it were 2 different countries. The phone rang again. Then her personal cell. Then the landline. At 3:19 a.m., the hospital's main administrative line called. She let it ring itself silent. At 4:44 a.m., a different number appeared on her screen. No caller ID. Just a Washington, D.C. area code with a prefix she recognized, the Pentagon Secure Operator Network. She almost didn't answer. Then she thought of the Admiral's chest rising and falling, of the sinus rhythm returning to his monitor, of 7 doctors walking away from a man who was supposed to die. She answered without speaking. Captain Walsh. Not a question. The voice belonged to someone accustomed to being obeyed. This is Deputy Director Chen from Naval Intelligence. St. Michael's Hospital's routine background audit flagged your file at 2:14 a.m. when your classified security clearance appeared in the federal database. We had calls to the Pentagon within 18 minutes. The hospital's next call was to the State Nursing Board at 2:31 a.m. You have exactly 6 minutes before that board chairman receives a federal hold order that supersedes his authority. Stay on the line. Margaret heard the click of transfer, then silence except for the hum of encrypted circuits. Rain continued its percussion against the windows. Emma shifted in her sleep. The clock read for 34 a.m. A new voice, older, carrying the weight of command authority. Captain, this is Admiral James Kincaid. I'm awake now. I know who you are. I know what you did. The man beside my bed, the Marine Recon officer who helped save my life, he recognized your technique from Baghdad, 2019. He came forward at 0300 hours. Your cover is burned, but your mission isn't over. Not yet. The Admiral's voice cracked slightly. Shadow 6. You didn't have to do that. You should have let me die. Margaret's jaw tightened. 6 years of fieldwork, months of embedded surveillance, her entire operational cover dissolved to protect one man who'd already been targeted twice for assassination in Baghdad. She'd known the risks. She'd accepted them. But sitting in her kitchen with her daughter against her chest, the cost suddenly had a different weight. Sir. 2 words. That's all she could manage. I'm not finished. The Admiral's voice steadied, returned to the clipped precision of military command. A Marine colonel is entering your hospital right now. He's carrying your citation. Your daughter stays with your sister tonight. You pack a bag with items for 72 hours. You're no longer a nurse, Captain. You're operational again, and we have cleaning to do. The line disconnected. Margaret didn't move for 30 seconds. Just breathed. Just existed in the space between 2 lives, the one she'd been living and the one she'd never really left. Then she moved with the economy of someone who'd trained for this exact moment. Woke her sister by phone. Explained nothing. Packed Emma's favorite stuffed bear into a small bag. Kissed her forehead and watched her ride away in an Uber at 4:13 a.m., her little voice calling back, Mommy, where are you going? Work, baby. I'll be home soon. The lie came smooth as any medication dose she'd administered. St. Michael's was a different building at dawn. The night shift was handing off to day shift when Margaret walked through the employee entrance in civilian clothes, jeans, a grey shirt, her jacket with the faded unit patch sewn into its lining still against her shoulder. The circulation desk nurse did a double take. Word had spread. Margaret was the nurse who'd attacked a patient with a knife. The nurse who was under investigation. The danger. She didn't look at anyone. The Admiral's room on the 4th floor was surrounded by quiet now. The machines still beat their mechanical rhythm, but the urgency had drained away. He was stable. Recovering. The kind of recovery that shouldn't have been possible according to 7 doctors who declared him futile. When Margaret entered, Admiral Kincaid's eyes opened. He'd been watching the door. Waiting. His gaze found her face, and for 3 seconds neither of them moved. Then he whispered the word that collapsed her entire civilian identity in a single breath. Shadow 6. The room contained 6 people. A Marine colonel in dress blues. 2 Pentagon officials in dark suits. A hospital administrator who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor tiles. A young Marine Recon officer who'd served under Margaret's command in Baghdad 4 years ago. And Margaret, standing at the back of the room in civilian clothes that suddenly felt like a costume made of lies. The Marine colonel stepped forward, a leather folder in his hands. He opened it with the precision of ceremonial bearing and began to read in a voice that echoed like a courtroom instead of a hospital room. Captain Margaret Walsh, recipient of the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism under fire. Citation reads as follows: for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy in Baghdad, Iraq, from June 2019 through August 2019. Captain Walsh performed 17 emergency combat surgeries under direct enemy contact, operating in forward field positions with active hostile fire occurring within 100 meters of her surgical site. Her actions resulted in the preservation of 44 military lives and the prevention of 17 combat-related deaths that would otherwise have resulted from the severity of injury sustained. Captain Walsh's medical expertise, demonstrated under conditions of extreme duress, reflects the highest tradition of naval service and selfless dedication to her fellow service members. The room was silent. The kind of silence that only exists in moments that rewire everything people thought they understood. A two-star general stepped through the door. Margaret hadn't heard it open, hadn't heard anything except the colonel's voice describing a version of her she'd buried for years ago. The general raised his hand in salute. Not a casual gesture. A formal military salute. His fist came to his chest, and every uniformed person in the room mirrored the movement. Margaret didn't salute back. She was still too far from that person. Still wearing her civilian clothes. Still the nurse who'd been fired 6 hours earlier. The Admiral reached out, his arm moving with the caution of fresh surgery, and pulled the chair beside his bed. "Come here, Captain," he said quietly. "You need to be sitting for this next part." Margaret Saturday. The chair held her weight. The room held its breath. The two Pentagon officials approached with folders bearing official seals, the kind of paperwork that sealed everything, opened everything, made everything simultaneously classified and undeniable. One of them spoke with the cadence of lawyers and military bureaucrats, the voice of institutional authority reshaping reality. "Your operational code name is being elevated from Shadow 6 to Nightingale 7. Your nursing position at St. Michael's is hereby reinstated retroactively as a classified assignment under Department of Defense Authorization Section 2635. Dr. James Mercer's report to the State Nursing Board is being superseded by federal order. The State Board has received a confidential advisory that no charges will be filed against you. You are hereby released from any civilian investigation related to your actions at St. Michael's Hospital in the past 18 hours. The official paused. "There's more." He didn't need to finish. Margaret understood. If the Pentagon was protecting her, then Mercer had moved into a different legal universe. One where federal authority began its reckoning. The Admiral's voice cut through her thoughts. The joint investigation was launched this morning at 0600 hours. Internal Affairs, federal auditors, and the State Medical Board initiated a comprehensive review of Dr. James Mercer's surgical outcomes and personnel management practices over the past 3 years. Margaret closed her eyes. They found 17 formal complaints against him that were never documented through official channels. Nurses who reported surgical errors, his errors, who were then transferred, demoted, or encouraged to resign. One nurse, Sarah Chen, reported a medication miscalculation in 2021. Within 2 weeks, she was reassigned to pediatrics. Another nurse, Marcus Rodriguez, reported a post-op infection he'd caused. Rodriguez was put on a performance improvement plan and eventually quit. A third nurse, Patricia Thompson, reported a botched suture line. Thompson was terminated for nursing negligence. The Admiral's voice carried the flat tone of someone reading an indictment. Each time, Dr. Mercer documented the mistake as stemming from nursing failure. Each time, he protected himself by destroying staff members. "The investigation is ongoing," one of the Pentagon officials added. His hospital privileges were suspended at 0530 hours this morning. The State Medical Board has accelerated his license review. "We expect a determination within 2 weeks." Margaret heard the words but remained at a distance from them. The rain outside the window had stopped. The morning had turned clear and sharp, the kind of Atlanta morning that came after storms, when the air smelled like electricity and renewal. A nurse entered with fresh fur bags. She saw Margaret sitting beside the Admiral and froze for just a moment, recognition, confusion, then understanding that something had shifted in the room's power structure. She changed the 4 without comment and left. The room began to empty. Bureaucrats returned to their respective offices. The general departed with a nod. The Marine colonel folded his citation back into the leather folder. By 7:15 a.m., only Margaret, the Admiral, and the young Marine recon officer remained. The Marine approached Margaret with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a sacred object. "I should have come forward sooner. In Baghdad, you taught me that precision matters more than ego, that technique matters more than credentials. I forgot that when I got to the civilian world. When I saw what you did last night, that 3-layer closure, the anterior mediastinal approach, I remembered. I'm sorry it took me until now to speak up." Margaret met his eyes. "You remembered when it counted, Lieutenant. That's all that matters." 6 months later, the rain had come and gone in cycles, and the city had returned to its ordinary rhythms. Margaret stood in the St. Michael's cafeteria in dress whites, her captain's bars gleaming under the fluorescent lights that had once witnessed her humiliation. The uniform fit differently now. The weight of it felt like purpose instead of burden. Through the window, she could see across the street to the community college annex where Dr. Mercer stood in a classroom, demonstrating CPR compressions to a group of distracted students who checked their phones between practice rounds. His name tag read, Instructor Mercer. Not Doctor. Not anymore. His salary, according to the human resources contact who'd helped coordinate the transition, was $13.50 per hour. The hospital administrator had offered her full reinstatement, back pay, a formal apology that stretched across 3 pages of institutional mea culpa. Margaret had declined everything except the back pay. That went to the legal funds for the other nurses, the ones Mercer had destroyed. "You're staring," Admiral Kincaid said, appearing beside her with 2 members of his protective detail. His scar had faded to the color of old parchment, but his hand still went to it sometimes, like confirmation that he'd survived something that shouldn't have been survivable. He touched the scar now. "Don't waste the energy on him, Captain. Some people are small in ways that can't be fixed." "I'm not staring," Margaret said quietly. "I'm making sure he remembers why he's teaching CPR to community college students instead of operating on soldiers." The Admiral smiled. Shadow 6. "You're going to tell me you don't feel satisfaction?" "I feel like I did my job, sir." Both of them. Emma waited by the hospital entrance, holding a small briefcase that matched her mother's. She'd finally understood, or at least accepted, that Captain Margaret Walsh existed in a different world than Nurse Margaret Walsh, that the badge looked different now because the work was different, that salutes meant something serious. She'd learned not to ask questions about the briefings or the helicopter rides or why Mommy sometimes wore a uniform instead of scrubs. As they walked toward the exit, Margaret passed the spot where her write-up had hung on the unit board, the documentation of her insubordination, her supposed incompetence, her danger to the institution. The board had been updated. New schedules. New announcements. No trace of Dr. Mercer remained except in the permanent record of his failure. One final pass by the window. Mercer looked up from his CPR dummy, meeting her eyes across the distance. For a moment, something flickered across his face, recognition, humiliation, the specific gravity of a man who'd made a calculation about someone and been catastrophically wrong. Margaret didn't smile. Didn't gloat. Didn't give him the satisfaction of her emotion. She simply nodded once, acknowledgement, not victory, and turned away. In the car, Emma asked what power meant. Margaret considered the question, thinking of the Admiral alive, thinking of the nurses who'd found their voices, thinking of the investigation that revealed truth like water seeping through concrete. "Power is not a title," Margaret said quietly. "Power is the ability to help." Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. In her mother's hand, it did. The helicopter was waiting at the rendezvous point 30 miles north. Margaret's next assignment was already loaded in the briefcase. The Admiral's protection detail required a permanent embedded medical asset, and the naval intelligence operation that had brought her to St. Michael's had never truly concluded. It had only transformed. Shadow 6 was becoming Nightingale 7, and the mission continued in the ways that mattered, in the spaces where quiet people did extraordinary things and never told anyone about it. Emma watched the rotor blades begin their spin, watched her mother transform once more from mother to captain, watched the line between two lives blur and resolve into singular purpose. She buckled her safety harness and held her briefcase and understood that some people carried two names and two lives because the work demanded it. The helicopter lifted off at 1,400 hours. Below, Atlanta spread out like a map of places Margaret had already saved and places she would save again. And somewhere in the city, a man taught CPR compressions for minimum wage, remembering every single time he opened his mouth that he'd been wrong about someone who mattered. That was the real power. Not the title. The ability to help. The ability to be understood. The ability to ensure that the next time someone decided to judge the quiet person in the room, they thought very carefully about what they couldn't see. Like and subscribe if you believe nurses deserve more respect. And tell me honestly, what would you have done in her shoes? I'm pinning the best answer.